Well, Christian May is spokesman for the Institute of Directors, and he's therefore is in central London. Christian May, good morning.
Good morning.
How do you react to this?
Well, I think Ed Miliband is quite right to set out how he would tackle situations where zero-hours contracts are being used to exploit workers. Now, that might be in large companies. I think we saw with Sports Direct, for example, where they just use zero-hours contracts in place of full-time employment. Or, of course, in the public sector, which is the other main area, in the care sector, for example, where these contracts appear to be abused. So it's quite right, and I'm sure the government would agree with the Labour Party, who are currently conducting their own inquiry into this. But, of course, banning anything outright will always have unintended consequences. Now, we support, at the Institute of Directors, we support the idea of serious limitations on the exclusivity clauses in these contracts. That's when the employer says you can't work for anyone else, even if you might not be working for us this day. We think that there will always be certain circumstances where they have a use and a value, but certainly they should be the exception and not the norm.
Well, let's look in a bit more detail, because that's certainly one area that Labour is planning to have a look at, as you rightly point out. They're saying that workers on zero-hours contracts would not be obliged to be available outside contracted hours. They would be free to work for other employers, have a right to compensation if shifts are cancelled at short notice. Do you have any arguments with any of those?
Well, I think it's quite right to recognise that the nature of work is changing. Now, there are all sorts of factors in that. The demographic changes. There will, of course, be ever-increasing technological changes. So I think to say to somebody in rigid terms that you cannot sell your labour, or you cannot seek to make money or a living in other avenues whilst I've got your name on this piece of paper, does sound a little bit Dickensian. I think there needs to be more of the flexibility, which is, of course, the whole point behind these contracts.
But it's degrees of flexibility, and that's perhaps where you, on occasions, and Labour might part company on this. Is that fair?
Well, I think that is fair, because we know that this is actually quite a fringe issue. The numbers of people on zero-hours contracts can be about 2% of the workforce, and as I say, often in particular sectors like local government and the care sector. But of course, also they exist in the professions and in areas of great technical service. So I'm going to give you a scenario. If somebody takes on somebody with great technical expertise for a limited period on a specific contract, it's quite logical that they might say, and during this engagement period, you can't go and work for, say, a competitor or a rival or another company. So that's the areas where we think these exclusivity clauses might have some validity, but of course they shouldn't be used to prevent people from legitimately trying to find work in their own time.
Can I pick you up on that point about the scale of this? Because you've talked about it being a relatively small in terms of how much this is happening around the country. We're told, Mr. Miliband will say, and I quote, "Zero-hour contracts have spread like an epidemic across our economy."
Yeah, I think that there might be a little bit of the politics leading the policy here. I can understand why the Labour Party are keen to come up with something big on the issue of zero-hours contracts, because they have found their way into the public imagination, and they do crop up as a reference point when people are discussing the nature of the economic recovery. So perhaps a little bit of politics leading policy there. He wants to tie it in, I would imagine, to his broader plans to tackle what they call the cost of living crisis. But actually, we're talking between 500,000 and 1 million people on zero-hours contracts. Plenty of them will be students. They will be working in seasonal or hospitality work, and they will be benefiting from that flexibility. So I think it's important to keep this in perspective. It's not as if this is going to be Labour's Clause 4 moment. It's quite a fringe reform to the labour market.
Thank you for coming on, Christian May from the Institute of Directors.